desperate struggle with the villain, but on with the story. They're off! As far as Oil Can Harry is concerned, this is a fight to the finish. He says...
And they're kooky, mysterious.
Greetings, Bat fans. This is Batman.
And Robin, the Boy Wonder.
The Cold War began when the Soviet Union became America's toxic ally, that is. Tensions arose at the Potsdam Conference, in which Stalin and Truman argued over free elections in Eastern European countries. So what was the US to do? Contain communism where it is, of course. Containment was initiated with the Truman Doctrine, which pledged military and economic assistance to countries under threat, namely Greece and Turkey. It's a step further with the Marshall Plan, which pledged billions of dollars in economic assistance to Western Europe to help them rebuild their economies after World War II. Then we get into our first tussle with the USSR, the Berlin Airlift. West Berlin was trapped within East Berlin, which was communist and supported by the USSR, and the Soviets cut off access to the city. The United States saved Berlin by airlifting goods for 231 days, encouraging a positive sentiment towards the US. To anticipate further threats, the United States formed its first peacetime treaty, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. This alliance with Western Europe and Canada promised collective security, that an attack against one member would be an attack against all. The next hotspot was Korea, meet your fighters. North Korea, communists backed by the Soviet Union, and South Korea, backed by the US. To counter North Korea's invasion, the US led a United Nations authorized force. To project an image of strength, the USSR and United States raced to develop technologically through better weapons and space exploration. Cold War tension reached its height during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Soviet plans to send missiles to Cuba were discovered, leading President John F. Kennedy to place a naval quarantine around Cuba. For 13 days, there was a very real possibility of nuclear war. This led Kennedy and Soviet Union Khrushchev to diplomatically agree to policies of de-escalation. Fear of communism also perpetrated domestic policy, resulting in a widespread paranoia of the communist subversion called the Red Scare. The House Un-American Committee investigated private citizens, public employees, and organizations suspected of having communist ties. Similarly, Senator Joseph McCarthy, a senator from Wisconsin, launched a series of probes into alleged communism within the government. Those charged could be blacklisted and lose their jobs, ruining their careers and lives forever. Are you a communist?
I prefer not to answer.
No, I'm not a communist.
She's wearing red.
Guys, should we send money to Greece and Turkey to prevent communist subversion?
My yaya said to say yes.
I think it will stop communism, but we should probably send it anyway.
You a communist?
No.
No.
Should we send money to Greece and Turkey to prevent communist subversion?
Yes, we need to.
As more soldiers returned from war and the United States economy boomed, government subsidies such as the GI Bill were made so that more veterans could go to college and purchase homes, resulting in the younger generation splitting into two main social groups. The younger families who chose to settle down and marry young, contributing to the rise of birth rates known as the baby boom, and the reform-minded college students who made up much of the counterculture. The suburbs grew as more young families moved out there because they were able to afford to buy homes seen in neighborhoods such as Levittown, which all marketed themselves as a place where families could go to raise children among others like themselves. Despite the major gains made by the civil rights movement in the 1960s, these suburbs were heavily segregated and almost all white. An increase in college enrollment led to a new culture among teenagers and young adults who chose to not settle down and marry young, seen in new styles of fashion, arts, and music. Students became one of the driving forces behind the reform movements of the 1960s, aiding the civil rights movement, the gay rights movement, different anti-war protests, and overall much of the social reform movement in that time period. One of the more well-known examples of the counterculture were hippies, the free-spirited individuals who were against the cookie-cutter lifestyle and the idea of the nuclear family. Hippie culture favored bright colors, a lax attitude regarding drug usage and sexuality, and most hippies were anti-war, especially against the draft.
Because he was killed because he was mean.
Lee Harvey Oswald.
Rhinoceros beetle.
John Lennon.
Cold-blooded.
As we've been taught, the civil rights movement changed the course of history, but how? Let's start with what the civil rights movement aimed to diminish: Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow laws were a set of extremely racist laws that were predominantly enforced in the South. After a series of protests against the segregation of schools in the court case Brown versus Board of Education, it was ruled that segregated schools were unconstitutional, no matter how, quote, equal the segregated schools were. The infamous arrestment of Rosa Parks kickstarted the Montgomery bus boycotts, the refusal of African Americans to use public transportation until it was made illegal to segregate buses. Another face we're all familiar with is Martin Luther King Jr. and his I Have a Dream speech, which occurred at the March on Washington. This march not only aimed to gain passage of the Civil Rights Act, but also to address economic inequality and neglect within the workforce. The aforementioned Civil Rights Act was a monumental step forward in American politics, as it ruled discrimination based on race, sex, religion, and nationality illegal. Gaining access to vote from the 15th Amendment was a big step, but it didn't immediately solve all issues, especially considering the plethora of racist systems put in place to make voting difficult as a way to discourage people from wanting to vote. Freedom Summer was a summer of protest and determination against the discriminatory voting system that strived for gaining a greater amount of Black voters in order to make politics a little more fair. Thanks to the perseverance that was sparked by the Freedom Summer, the Voting Rights Act was passed. This act officially ended the annoying racist voting systems and allowed for African Americans to have equal access to voting. Discrimination was still rampant despite all of these successes, especially in the school system. In the case Back versus University of California, it was ruled that schools could not utilize a racial quota system in admissions. All of these movements inspired others to speak up for their own communities or even planets. Silent Spring, a book written by Rachel Carson, spoke on the threat of environmental issues and inspired the birth of the first Earth Day in 1970. This Earth Day marked the beginning of an era of environmental awareness. Labor strikes and unions have always been a hot topic in history, yet they rarely seem to accomplish anything. All of this changed with the introduction of Cesar Chavez and his National Farm Workers Association. This association succeeded in establishing a higher minimum wage and providing workers with health benefits for their troubles, the common practice seen today. The National Organization for Women, or NOW, aimed to end discrimination based on sex and provide women with securities such as abortion. The Stonewall riots were a reactionary string of riots and boycotts against the violent attack of police officers on a gay bar, Stonewall. These boycotts not only raised attention for the injustice of the police attack, but also for gay rights in general. Roe v. Wade ruled that women have the legal right and protection to go through with an abortion without a series of purposefully annoying systems in the way to keep them from performing it. You might be familiar with it considering the current controversy surrounding it. All in all, leaps and bounds were made in the civil rights movement, which inspired other movements to step up and fight for their needs.
What do you know about the civil rights movement?
Martin Luther King Jr. was a big part of it, like walks and lots of protests.
What do you know about the civil rights movement?
I know that the civil rights movement had. Oh, dude, I just learned this.
What do you know about the civil rights movement?
Which one? I don't know, homosexual civil rights movement.
That's not the question!
A couple influential leaders, Martin Luther King, Malcolm X, all that jazz. Jazz was also pretty cool.
The last war that would accept drafts, the Vietnam War. People around our age so many years ago would be drafted to fight in the Vietnam War. They were picked out based on their birthday. If you missed the cutoff, lucky you. And for everyone else, I hope you packed an extra pair of socks. This war was super controversial amongst everyone all around our country. The most notable protest was located at Kent State University. Students got together to peacefully protest about the war, saying that we shouldn't be involved, it's not our war, and young men shouldn't go die for an empty cause. For some weird reason, this triggered Ohio National Guard and decided to open fire on the group of students, injuring 9 students and killing 4 more. The Gulf of Tonkin. Turns out the US government was a little bit of a cancer and was a little oversensitive. The US claimed North Vietnam attacked its warships unprovoked, although there is a debate about how unprovoked and how much attacking there was. In response, Congress issued the Gulf of Tonkin Resolution, giving Johnson unprecedented power to take military action, allowing him to send more troops to South Vietnam and beginning. Tet Offensive. The Tet Offensive involves a series of attacks between the North and South Vietnamese, specifically surprise attacks from Vietnam. This helped bring light to American citizens at home on how far we actually were from winning the war, known as the credibility gap. It was unsettling for Americans to hear because for weeks, TVs and political leaders had been saying how close they were to winning the war. Let's talk about our presidents, Johnson and Nixon. Johnson was all about his Great Society. The Great Society was a group of driven people, policies, and programs that aimed to reduce racial injustice, improve the environment, lower the poverty line, and reduce crime. He also talked about Medicare, which is health insurance for older people, Medicaid, which is health insurance for low-income households, and Job Corps, which provided people between the age of 16 and 24 shelter, food, job training, and healthcare if they agreed to work. He also addressed the Civil Rights Act and Voting Rights Act, which Chloe had previously covered. And now Nixon. Nixon was all about Vietnamization, which means to draw out troops from Vietnam and to surrender with honor. Detente. He was all about detente, which means easing Cold War tensions between the US and Soviet Union. Strategic Arms Limitations Talk. Nixon had a great deal in this. It limited the number of missiles produced, contained, and used between the United States and Soviet Union. Nixon is most well known for his Watergate scandal. This scandal involved people in Nixon's party, the Republicans, breaking into the offices of the Democratic Party and stealing secret papers. It took a tremendous toll on Nixon and his co-workers. On August 8, 1974, Nixon declared his resignation and left the White House, with General Ford taking his place.
What continent is Vietnam in?
Antarctica.
Yeah. What continent is Vietnam in?
South Africa?
Yeah. What continent is Vietnam in?
Asia.
Yeah. What continent is Vietnam in?
Africa.
Yeah. What continent is Vietnam in?
Asia.
Yeah. What continent is Vietnam in?
Trick question, it's its own continent.
Yeah.
Next up, we're going to be looking at the LEQ, which makes up 15% of your AP exam score. There are 6 possible points you can earn on your APUSH LEQ. Contextualization, which you get by describing a broader historical context relevant to the prompt. Thesis point, which you get for responding to the prompt with a historically defensible claim that establishes a line of reasoning. Your evidence point 1, which you get from providing specific examples of evidence relevant to the topic, and number 2, which you get for supporting an argument in response to the prompt using specific evidence. The last 2 points you can earn are in the analysis and reasoning category. Number 1, you can earn from using historical reasoning like comparison, causation, or continuity and change over time to frame or structure an argument that addresses the prompt. The second one is demonstrating a complex understanding of the historical development that is the focus of the prompt, using evidence to corroborate, qualify, or modify an argument that addresses the question. We're going to look at a sample prompt from the College Board 2019 released FRQs. Evaluate the extent to which ideas about democracy contributed to the African American civil rights movement in the period from 1940 to 1970. When you get a prompt, you want to make sure you're looking at what it's asking you to do. When this prompt says evaluate, it's asking you to compare different examples of how democracy contributed to the African American civil rights movement. Make sure you're also noting the time period in which it's asking you to remain in. Here's an example of a thesis that would work for this prompt that our group came up with. From 1940 to 1970, ideas of democracy and equality significantly contributed to equity during the civil rights movement through the ideas that separate is not equal, voting rights, and tackling racism through nonviolence and black power. Your thesis should clearly display your main claim as well as some historical examples you're going to use throughout your essay to back it up. To summarize, there's 5 main things you want to remember when you're writing an LEQ. Have an overarching idea or claim, connect your evidence, use historical thinking skills, demonstrate deeper understanding of the content, and make sure your argument remains clear throughout your writing.
Alright, on a scale of 1 to 10, how well do you think you did on the APUSH LEQ?
Probably like an 8.
Probably like a 8 too.
Love the confidence.
Like a 17.
Probably like a -2. Maybe.
On a scale of 1 to 10, how confident are you in us that we passed the AP exam?
Oh, about 100.
took a while to answer that. Okay, and how confident are you that we did well in the LAQ?
Very confident.
The United States attempted to contain the spread of communism during the Cold War through the Marshall Plan, NATO, and proxy conflicts like the Vietnam War. At home, there was a deep fear of communism called the Red Scare, in which the government suppressed civil liberties to investigate communists.
The US went through a huge period of economic growth that led to the rise of the middle class and a counterculture and youth culture in opposition. Welfare reforms by JFK and Johnson helped reduce poverty.
The Vietnam War was shaped by the differing policies of Johnson, who led the country into war, and Nixon, who ultimately withdrew the U.S. involvement. A movement of protest against the war like Kent State developed.
The LEQ requires you to use your own historical evidence to create a defensible claim.